Shining Soul! Yeah! I always wanted to do something like that, and I think I just threw my voice out, so I guess we gotta be quick about this. This is Shining Soul, a game I'm actually not very familiar with at all. When I saw Shining on the Game Boy Advance, I thought it was a remake of the original Shining Force, because, as far as I knew, that was the only Shining game on there. And I was actually very, very excited about that because Shining Force, as well as its sequel Shining Force 2, along with Gundam Wing, were all in one day collectively my intro to anime. So I've got actually quite a lot of fondness for the Shining series. Also, it was made by Camelot, the people who made Golden Sun, although they didn't work on this one. And also, it's not Shining Force, it's Shining Soul. So, unfortunately, pretty much all my nostalgia for this series is kind of hampered by the fact that this is, like, kind of vaguely connected in name alone, and that's about it. But that said, I get to get excited about playing a whole new game I knew nothing about, so that's kind of cool. And, I mean, this is an action RPG. That's my favorite genre, and it's on the GBA. It's like my favorite handheld, and it's the point where handhelds kind of became their own sort of console quality experiences. And I gotta say, well, I wouldn't necessarily say this is the best action RPG on the system. I did some extensive testing with the original Shining Soul just to see what that was about, mainly because I didn't realize this was Shining Soul 2, and you can kind of tell by that intro, because I learned that after I recorded all of this. That's a week worth of work down the drain. But, you know, this is Shining Soul 2, and compared to the first game, which could best be described as basically, kind of, sort of, almost barely functional, this game's a lot better. It's actually a genuinely quite good experience. Not great, maybe, but genuinely a very, very good experience. Shining Soul 2, very, very good. Let's get into this proper. Now, the story to Shining Soul 2 is kind of a lot of things all sort of happen at once. First of all, the magic glass orb of destiny becomes cloudy, which is apparently a bad thing. I mean, I've played games where the plot was that the water's a little bit muddy and that's a bad sign, so you know what, we're a step above Lagoon at the very least. Also, the princess has disappeared, and also, the kingdom doesn't really know it yet, but they're about to be invaded by like this giant force, so you gotta go do something about all of that, which is great. But first, we have to figure out who you are, and there's a lot of options here. There's about 10 different characters, and hey, there's 10 different colors for each character, so every character has 10 different variations visually, which means you can really kind of customize your character's visual appearance, which is really, really cool, and each character fills in a slightly different slot. Sure, it's not super, super grand. There's just a lot of melee guys, a lot of magic guys, you know, they kept it fairly basic, but with slightly different nuance to it, but it's still very appreciated. And every single one of these characters has like a different stat profile as well as leveling up potential, which is great. Story-wise, this game is leagues better than the first game as well. The first game was just, you know, there's a villain, go do some sequential dungeons and get over it. Whereas this game, the plot evolves as you play. And there's actual, like, side quests and stuff. And stuff where you can develop your connection to the people in this world. Not deeply, but still, there's things here. Again, all completely absent from the first game. You then are tasked with going into sequential dungeons, going in, killing monsters, leveling up, and gaining experience and equipment. A little unfortunate you can find equipment that you can't use, because it's really just there to clutter your inventory, which is very, very limited, although you can sell it. One of the biggest issues I've had with this game, also with the original, and one of the few things that wasn't fixed between the two, was this is an action RPG, a genre that focuses certainly on stats, but to me, at least personally, has always been more of a show of ability of skill, you know? This is what I always loved about action RPGs back when I was a kid who was too impatient to grind and level and wanted to skip fights just to move through story. I wanted a game that would allow me to, through my own skill, avoid attacks and hit my opponents and win through skill alone, even if my numbers weren't big enough. And this game kinda doesn't do that because there's not really any defensive tech. You just sort of clumsily, slowly meander through the dungeons, and the best way you can just sort of avoid attacks is to slowly sort of nudge yourself out of the way, and even that doesn't necessarily work because hitting your opponents isn't necessarily a function of being able to connect your hitbox with your opponents. That's the first check. However, it also requires a significant stat check to the dexterity stat because that governs hitting something. And the fact that you can stand in your opponent and wail on them with, well, in my case, a book because I played a dark mage, or hit them with a magic spell but miss just because the dexterity didn't scale properly. It's very, very weird. And going back to defense, while there is something like a shield stat, which an NPC spent way too long trying to explain to me. Seriously, I think the writers got paid by the word here. It's all a background stat that happens passively. It basically checks, oh, did your numbers hit the right threshold? If so, you blocked some damage, or you reduced damage, or you reflected it. But it's not something you actively do. Typically in an action RPG, I'd like to have a manual block or dodge. You know, something that gives me a sense of agency in being able to keep my character alive, as opposed to simply relying on numbers. And it feels almost like a betrayal of its core concept as an action RPG, once again taking it all back to the combat and action being centered more around your abilities as a player as opposed to your character's inherent stats. And in turn, it makes you feel like you have zero agency in your character's survivability. It's just, does the computer say I get hit, or did I survive? And taking away your control over your character's survivability makes it a far less immersive experience, and it makes it kind of, like I've said, a betrayal of the core genre. At least where I'm sitting. Another oddity with the gameplay is the fact that this game really doesn't have any sort of punishment for failure. Like, you can lose all your life, and you'll get knocked out, and you'll get pulled out of the dungeon, and the closest thing to real punishment you get is they take away all the money you had in your pockets at the time. Except when you get to the village, there's a bank that you can just stash all your money in before you leave, and most of the money you make is from just selling all the equipment you find. So you really shouldn't have much money on you at any point in the dungeon. And then you can just go talk to the angel who hauled you out of the dungeon, and he'll reset where you were. Like, literally, you might lose a few gold, but that's kinda it. There's no other real sort of punishment for failing or getting, like, stuck in your opponent and getting hit a whole bunch of times when you really shouldn't have because the numbers don't line up quite right or whatever. You know, it's just kind of weird that this game lets you basically run headlong into danger with really the only threat to you being a loss of time. It's really quite odd. And while I'm on a sort of complaining kick, there was one other really big thing that kind of bothered me about this game, and it was, again, one of the few things the original game also did badly that wasn't fixed, and that was the leveling system. Because when you gain enough experience and level up, you can then select whatever stat you want to boost, which is nice. I kind of went with more of a glass cannon sort of thing, focusing entirely on allowing me to use more magic, which does kind of show that there is a sense of creating your own builds here. You could be more tanky or more offensive, which is cool. But then you have like a skill point that you can associate, and putting a skill point into something is simple enough. You put a skill point in it, you get the ability. But once you level it up past the first level, it gets a little weird. Because instead of putting a second skill point in and then getting level 2, instead you have to put 2 skill points in. One for the first slot, one for the second slot. For 3, you have to put 1, 2, 3, and like everything has, I think, something like 7 slots. So by the end, you're pretty much sinking like 25 levels into one ability just to, you know, have the final level of it. It just feels a little bit unnecessarily drawn out to get these abilities, especially because there's not a lot of choice here. Like, don't get me wrong, they have lots of options, but a lot of them are dictated by what kind of weapons you use. And by sinking in points to this, you unlock greater and greater levels of a charge attack. But the bigger issue here, specifically with the charging weapons, is that it has a second function in that it allows you to equip higher grades of your equipment. If you put 1 skill point in one weapon and then level up to the second level of the second weapon, you'll be able to equip higher variations of that second weapon. But if you run to a weapon that requires 3, you won't be able to use it. So, like, the first thing you need to do is sink, like, the first, again, I haven't done the math, but I'm going to say 25 just for the sake of, you know, keeping flow here, 25 levels into one weapon before you sink anything into anything else, just so that you don't run into the potential of running into equipment that might save your life and not be able to use it. The drawing out of this leveling system and tying equipment to it effectively removes any sort of sense of choice that a character build actually proposes. It's very, very strange that they have equipment basically tied to your skill set, especially because the charge attacks are pretty underwhelming otherwise. Like, for magic, you need like 1 level to start using your charge, and then after that, it just takes exponentially longer to charge and more MP anyway, so again, that's another knock against it. Why would you bother? The game almost actively punishes you for using any of these charged abilities, really, especially if you're a mage. It's very strange. And I feel like if they just let you sink, 1 point, 2 points, simple enough, as opposed to having to sink 25 into one ability to max it out. Considering this game isn't super long, by the time you max out one ability, you're probably going to be near the end of the first run through the game and moving on to advanced mode. Which, sure, gives you a second reason to play through the game. It's harder, has enemies hit harder, you get better stuff, but it just seems a little bit weird that you can't really have as much control and customization and wiggle room if you actually want to be well equipped and actually able to handle your opponents without too much grind. One thing I will absolutely praise this game for, though, is its pacing, because the first game, comparatively, was awful. The first 2 stages were super easy, and then after that, they dragged forever, and the game just wanted to drag itself out, and it was a lot more monotonous than this game is. This game's actually pretty good comparatively. But what's really neat is that not only are each of the stages fairly well paced, but you can unlock new dungeons as you go by talking to people, unlocking side quests, and doing other little side jobs. And these side dungeons have rarer enemies, harder hitting enemies that do more damage, but a better reward and better experience. So it's worth going out of your way to do these things, and these little side dungeons help mix up the main game dungeons as well. It really does help the pacing, in addition to the fact that the story is constantly moving forward. Again, the first game didn't really have any of these things. I should know. I played a lot of it just to, test this game. But it also has a lot of enemies that help keep this game fresh as well. Every area has a small handful of enemies, as well as a very big and impressive boss. The bosses in this game are really big and cool and impressive looking, and it just keeps things fresh. Again, comparing to the first game, by the time you were in the second stage, you were already running into recolors. There's only about 20 or so different enemies in that game, and that was including the bosses. This game has so much more. It is just significantly better by leaps and bounds. Not perfect, mind you, but it's a far more functional game, it's a far more interesting game, and it gives you a lot more to expect here. I still wouldn't say this is the best action RPG on the system. I think Sword of Mana has this topped, and depending on how you count the Battle Network games, maybe them. But, at least this one is a fairly fun game. The previous one was a slog, and at best, barely functional. So I gotta give credit where credit's due. They improved the original by leaps and bounds. The overall presentation to Shining Soul 2 is a little all over the place. Visually, it looks stunning. I think the backgrounds and environments look like they're straight up painted, which is very impressive for the GBA, and the character models do look quite good. They reuse a few different enemy models from the first game, but otherwise everything seems to be brand new here. I did notice one reused environmental texture for one of the side bonus dungeons as well, but again, the game looks very nice for what you get. Audio-wise, I think it's fairly unspectacular, though. I honestly can't remember any music from the game, and I didn't think it was particularly interesting to listen to either. I think definitely presentation-wise, the visuals are doing a lot of the heavy lifting, whereas the audio lags behind a fair bit. Now, if you want a copy of Shining Soul 2 on the Game Boy Advance, cheapest one I'm seeing right now is about $100. Wow, this is very expensive for what you're getting here. The first game also costs about the same, and this was about the point when I finished my review and realized, oh crap, I was doing research on the wrong Shining Soul. Whoops. Because the stickers didn't match up with what I was looking at. Although there are some weird, replicas that use the second game stickers as well, so it's a little bit slightly easier to understand my confusion, I guess. But I think if you're gonna get a Shining Soul game, Shining Soul 2 is infinitely better. Like I said, the first game was, at best, barely functional. This is actually kinda good. It gives you replayability, it gives you side quests, it gives you fun optional areas and interesting extra things to do, lots of characters, build potentials. Sure, the actual action element, especially if you want to play defensively, is a little underwhelming to say the least, and yeah, okay, the leveling could be a little bit less drawn out and have every individual level be more significant, maybe give you better leveling options for skills as opposed to just dumping a bunch of individual levels into one skill and tying all your equipment to that. That's terrible. But otherwise, it's a pretty playable game and it's not bad. The first game, I couldn't recommend at all. This game, yeah, I could see recommending it. Not at the price it's going for, but I think it's decent. Like I said, I can think of several action RPGs for the system I would recommend over top of Shining Soul 2, but this one goes far and above what the first game did, and this one's actually a game I would be willing to recommend, provided you could get it at a fair price. I think $100 is a bit absurd. I could see spending maybe $20 on it. And I have to give a huge shout out and thank you to Jet Wolf for including this in his big box of awesome. We're actually at the bottom of it. Well, sort of. I have one more game. I've got a DS game, but I don't presently have a way to record DS stuff yet. Although I do have a device that I might be able to make work with that, but we'll see. Either way, huge shout out and thank you to Jet Wolf for the big box as well as this game individually. Lots of fun things there. A lot of games I really wanted to play and got a chance to. Really appreciate it. Really appreciate any support this channel gets because I certainly need it. But once again, thank you. This game is good. It's not great, but it's leaps and bounds better than the train wreck that was the first game.